Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to talk tonight about a subject which looks on the face of it fairly simple and obvious, but which is not at all simple when one examines it closely: the relationship of the individual to history. Let me begin by making an analogy out of, in the world of physics, the relationship between a gas and its component molecules. Now, the laws of gases deal with volumes, pressures, and temperatures, and their interdependence. But when we pass from the gases to the component molecules, we find that an individual molecule has no pressure, no temperature, and virtually no volume. All that it has in this particular context is kinetic energy and a tendency to random movement. We see then that the laws of gases are profoundly different from the laws governing individual molecules. And I think that mutatis mutandis, we can say that something of the same kind is true in relation to societies enduring over long periods of history and the individuals composing those societies. A society is really not an organism, it is just an organization. It has no powers of perception, no powers of thought, no powers of will. And in this respect, of course, it differs profoundly from the organisms which compose it. Now, of course, one of the most striking facts about the difference between individuals and societies is the extent to which their life, their biography, so to say, is predictable. In regard to societies which are composed of very large numbers, there is a fairly high degree of predictability. Any large mass of numbers can, of course, is subject to fairly accurate prediction. We can work out the average behavior of the innumerable particles within those large numbers and be pretty certainly right. And naturally, the larger the numbers, the more exact the laws. The numbers involved in even a very large society taken over a very long period are extremely small, of course, compared with the numbers which we deal with in physics. And for this reason, naturally, the laws or regularities we find in social masses are much less exact than the laws and regularities we find in societies. Nevertheless, there are detectable regularities in societies existing over long periods, and they are certainly significant. One of the sort of practical demonstrations of the difference between prediction in regard to individuals and prediction in regard to large numbers is illustrated by a consideration of fortune tellers on the one hand and insurance companies on the other. Both are concerned with the business of foretelling the future. But whereas, as far as I know, no fortune teller has ever ended up as a millionaire, no insurance company, if it's reasonably well managed, has ever gone bankrupt. So that we see that there is a profound practical difference between the two types of prediction. Where very large numbers are involved, we can predict sufficiently well for insurance companies to become immensely rich and to own practically everything in a huge country like this. Whereas fortune tellers, even the best of them, are extremely hit and miss in their predictions, and as I say, never end up by making great fortunes. of course, in relationship to large numbers, to societies, there is this, one can say of them, that the nature of social laws, social regularities, cannot be discovered by means of empathy with individuals, by feeling into their state of mind or even making inquiries about them. This will not tell us about the social regularities of the historical group of which they are members. Conversely, neither will the regularities which are detectable in the large groups tell us much about the destiny of any given individual. The actuaries of insurance companies will tell us that the average death age of a man is whatever it is, 69, of a woman 72. But this does not permit us to say that Mr. Jones will die punctually at 69 or that Mrs. Jones will live on for 3 years longer. This is merely the statement of a regularity which can be observed when we look at very large numbers. And of course, as it's now been realized since the time of Boltzmann, almost all general laws of nature are essentially statements of averages concerned with very large numbers. And that there is therefore this profound difference between the laws governing these great numbers of large societies enduring for a long period of time and the laws governing individuals. Now let us examine specifically what is the relationship between the individual and his society enduring in time. Any individual, of course, is surrounded by history, and his life runs parallel with a section of history. But to what extent is he in history? To what extent can he experience this process which is going on this large scale in relationship to great masses of people? Now, first of all, let us inquire what is history. This, of course, many historians have brought up different definitions of history, but I would like to cite one of them, the definition of history given by a contemporary philosophic historian, Arnold Toynbee. What Toynbee says is this, where he begins by asking a question. What will be singled out as the salient event of our time by future historians? Not any of the tragic, sensational, catastrophic events that fill the headlines and occupy our minds, rather the impact of Western civilization on other cultures and the reaction of those cultures on Western civilization and the ultimate emergence of a religion affirming the unity of mankind. Well, this is one way of looking at history, one philosophical way. Needless to say, there are many others. But all of them, I think, tend to take this extremely wide and generalized view of history. And the problem then, of course, is what is the relationship between an ordinary individual and this kind of history. Obviously, if we consider Toynbee's view of the important historical events of our time, nobody now living is aware of this history. This is a process on such a very large scale and over such a very long period that no single individual can really be conscious of it. So that in this sense, the individual is not living in the history which seems important to the philosophical historian. The only sort of history he is consciously living in is the kind of catastrophic history of the headlines, and we shall go into his relationship to those a little bit later. The philosophical historian, of course, is in the curious condition of a situation where he has to lead a double life. As an ordinary family man and citizen, he is living as a molecule, obviously, but he is thinking as a gas, or trying to think as a gas. And this, I think, does, in a sense, produce a kind of schizophrenia in him, which must be, I think, very uncomfortable, but nevertheless it is something which I think we all have to undergo, this kind of schizophrenia of the immediacy of individual life and the width and generality of life on the great scale. But now let us consider what is the relation of the individual even into the what may be called the semi-gaseous history of the catastrophic events of our time, quite apart from the emergence of a new religion and the action and reaction of cultures upon one another. What is, in general, the relationship between people, men and women, and these events? Now, before we go into close examination of this, let us just ask ourselves the question, how much of any individual life is related to history on either of these scales, on the fully gaseous scale or the semi-gaseous scale? Well, the first thing that strikes us is, of course, a most extraordinary fact that every human being passes a full third of his life completely outside of history and even outside of space and time. That is to say, he spends 8 hours a day asleep. And this is a profoundly important and interesting fact. It is the fact that we can, for 1/3 of our life, escape from our wretched egos and their problems, is the only thing which permits us to remain healthy and sane. It is known perfectly well that if people are cut off from sleep for any length of time, they will have a psychotic break, and they will also become physically very ill. And we then pass on from the question of sleep to other areas of human life. Before this, let me go on a little bit further with sleep. This is really, the more one thinks about sleep, the more extraordinary it is. I mean, it's fantastic, really, to remember that for 8 hours of each day, even the most violent fanatic, even the most fiendishly scheming devil, becomes, so to say, reconciled with the order of nature. He ceases to be himself and becomes this completely innocent and harmless creature. And I mean, which, thank heaven, does put a certain limit to the amount of harm he can do. But even a Himmler, even a Stalin, even a great financial operator like Jay Gould does spend 1/3 of his life in a state of innocence. And this is, I must say, a very consoling fact. What is less consoling is this, that whereas human beings can refresh themselves and gain new insights and new vitality during their sleep, organizations never sleep. They are like electronic machines which have been programmed in a certain way and which go on doing this thing indefinitely until somebody comes along and either smashes the machine or puts in a new program. But meanwhile, they go on in a state of chronic insomnia grinding out this particular thing that they were programmed to do. And I think this is one of the reasons why, when we examine the history of states and churches, we find so often that the records of their doing seem to be those of a kind of organized insanity. I remember when I was at school, we used to sing a hymn which went, how did it go? It went, "We thank thee that thy church unsleeping, while earth rolls onward into light, through all the world her watch is keeping, and rests not now by day or night." Well, this, of course, may account for the extremely unfortunate nature of a great deal of ecclesiastical history. That the church... The church never sleeps and is therefore gets no sort of direct refreshment. I mean, fortunately, its individual members sleep and have kind of inspirations from the beyond their own egos, and with immense difficulties can introduce reforms. But there is no way in which an organization, however holy it may appear, can itself refresh itself through sleep. That there is this profound difference between the individual and these large-scale organizations, and that the fact of sleep, I think, is of enormous importance, which we can't overlook. Now, from sleep, let us pass to some of the other aspects of human life, which are to a very large extent outside of history. Obviously, birth and infancy are almost completely outside of history, and even a great deal of childhood seems to go on with virtually no relation with the great historical processes going on. And the same thing is true of death. The decrepitude preceding death and death itself are again factors outside of history. The decrepit person is not aware of the great historical processes going on around him, and even relatively little aware of the short-range history. He is mainly aware with the diminution of his powers, the narrowing of his attention, the general closing in of everything around him. Some consciously historical figures have tried very hard to die in a historical way. It is reported, for example, of Daniel Webster, that when he was dying, and he was on his deathbed, he talked almost incessantly to his friends, and ended up, shortly before expiring, by turning to them and saying, "Have I said anything unworthy of Daniel Webster?" And after that, of course, the silence closed in, and that even the most historically minded person has to yield finally to the ultimate facts of physiology and the spirit. And in the end, as Lucretius says, "E ripitur persona manet res." The mask is ripped off, and only the reality remains. Now, not merely childhood and old age are outside history, but even considerable parts of sickness. I mean, many people spend quite a number of years of their life in ill health, and while they're in this state, they are again much really profoundly out of touch with the cultural and historic life of their times, much more completely preoccupied with their own bodily feelings and the sense of diminution which is going on in their life. And when we add up the amount of time which is spent, I mean, in a lifespan of 70 years, how much time is spent outside of history, we find that adding sleep to childhood and the average period of decrepitude and of sickness, we find that about 40 years of a 70-year lifespan are spent outside of history. Now, this I do think is a very strange and interesting fact that here we are immersed in history. Here we are the component molecules of a great social gas, and yet, as far as our consciousness is concerned, more than half our lifespan is passed entirely away from this world. But then we come to the question of private life. I mean, even when we are mature and fully awake, we have the choice between living in a sort of continuous contact with the historical movements going on around us, or living a strictly private life. The best definition of a desirable private life that I know of was given by Rozanov, the Russian essayist who died shortly after the revolution, very curious and interesting writer, who described a desirable private life as picking one's nose and looking at the sunset. And the more one thinks of this, the better it is, actually. It's a wonderful definition, because you can generalize it and point out that private life, enjoyable private life, is, of course, the enjoyment of physiological processes on one side and of aesthetic and intellectual and aesthetic processes on the other. And Rozanov's definition, I think, sums up a great deal of what our life is. We can, of course, go further into this. I mean, it's quite clear, for example, the sexual life is profoundly non-historical. There are many... our cultural arrangements do their best to regulate marriage and sexual life in general, but the direct experience of sexual life and the reason why it seems so profoundly important to people, I think, is precisely because, like sleep, it takes us out of history, out of the cultural relationships, out of the sort of boring pattern, even out of our personal identity. And this, of course, this final fact of sex being a kind of holiday from personal identity and from cultural and historical values was stressed again and again by D.H. Lawrence in his books. I mean, the kind of religious, the religion of the dark gods, the kind of mystical materialism of Lawrence's books are essentially about this, about the possibility of escaping through the blood, as he calls it, into this non-historical and even non-personal world. And of course, over and above these various physiological escapes from history and ourselves, there are the various aesthetic and intellectual escapes which are of immense importance, I think, to a great many people. And it's interesting in this context to look into the history, look into the biographies of people who have understood, be introspective and have understood the nature of their own lives, and to see what they have said about this fact. Let me quote a very remarkable passage from Montaigne, where he says, "Can I honestly enough confess with how very trifling a sacrifice of my tranquility and peace of mind I have lived almost half my life while my country was in ruins." Montaigne's life, of course, was contemporary with these unutterably savage religious wars which were going on in France in the later 16th century. And this is, Montaigne, of course, was one of the most honest and self-observant of men, and this is, I think, a very interesting testimony that a man can, by dint of living in an intellectual world, live completely apart and unaffected by the catastrophic events of his time. And we see, it's most interesting to look into the history of a number of great writers and to see the extent to which great artists of different types, the extent to which they seem to have been quite unmoved by the savage historical events of their time. Take a great musician of the 17th century, Heinrich Schütz. Well, Schütz, you read his biography, you find that he spent all his time running away from the 30 Years' War. He would be in one place and then the tide of battle would roll over and he would hastily go somewhere else. And he lived a hunted life, trying to get away from these dreadful warring armies who were devastating his country all the time. But you look in his music, and really I think you find absolutely no trace of this at all. The music simply follows a kind of logical, it follows its own inner logic. I shall go into this later when I talk about art, but it is very striking to find that this, you would think there would be a strong historical determinant in such a life as Schütz's, but not at all. It's the thing which conditions the development of his music is an internal logic within the music itself and within the music of his immediate predecessors. But then we take a case like that of Wordsworth. The lyrical ballads, the prelude, the great odes were all written between 1795 and 1807, which is, of course, was one of the most alarming periods of European history, and a period in which his country was at war for most of the time, in which a tremendous kind of social revolution, as well as a considerable fear of invasion, was going on in the mind of Englishmen. And still more extraordinary, of course, are the novels of Jane Austen. Pride and Prejudice was written, I think, 1796-97, and the other novels were written between 1811 and 1816. But one looks in vain in these delightful novels for any reflection of the really terrifying events which were going on while the books were being written. You have this impression that the life of the English country gentry and their clergy was going on exactly as ever, that they were just picking their noses and looking at the sunsets, in spite of Napoleon and in spite of the wild events going on in Europe and the menaces which threatened the islands all the time. Another example I take from the life of a man who has always interested me very much, the French philosopher, the greatest French philosopher of the later 18th and early 19th century, Maine de Biran, who left a very, very copious diary so that we know exactly what he was feeling and thinking every day of his life almost. But now, this is an entry in the early summer of 1794. Well, from a historical point of view, the summer of 1894 is important. It witnessed the execution of Danton and of Hébert, and it witnessed the consummation, the apogee of Robespierre's power, and the dedication of the terror to the Supreme Being. You look in vain in Maine de Biran's diary, really, for any reflection of these things. And here is an entry which is quite interesting. He says, "Today, May 27th, I had an experience too beautiful to be ever forgotten. I was walking by myself a few minutes before sunset, the usual thing. The sight of nature filled me with ecstasy. Ravishment succeeded ravishment. If I could perpetuate this state, I should have found upon this earth the joys of heaven. And once again, some years later, during the 100 Days, Biron found a retreat from history, which at that time was an extraordinarily uncomfortable thing for him, because he happened to be a convinced royalist who had gone over to the service of the returned kings, and then when they fled during Napoleon's return during the 100 Days, found himself in a very, very awkward position and in considerable danger. But what he says here during the 100 Days, he says, where does he, yes, he said, my mind is occupied with abstract speculations, foreign to all the interests of the world. These speculations keep me from thinking about the actions of my fellow men, and this is fortunate, for I cannot think of them except to hate and despise. I'm quite sure, even in the catastrophic events of the 20th century, we could undoubtedly find innumerable examples of the same kind of retreat into private life, and the fact that the retreat into private life was possible even in these catastrophic conditions. The only difference, I think, between the present and the past is this, that it is becoming, particularly in the authoritarian states, increasingly difficult for the individual to escape into private life. All the dictators have used every means at their disposal to compel people to give up their private life and to live a public life in continuous relation with the horrible history which the dictators, are manufacturing all the time. And as I say, they use all the resources at their disposal, and their resources are incomparably greater than anything that was disposed of by tyrants in the past. You have only to compare the secret police of any state today with the secret police of Napoleon to see that Napoleon's police was absolutely childish in comparison with any modern police force. The modern dictator, and for that matter the modern democratic government, has at its disposal all the resources for detection and coercion which can be imagined. Wiretapping, radio, past cars, everything. I mean, there is nothing which they don't have, and already this figure, this terrifying figure which Orwell projected into 1984, Big Brother, is in existence. In the past, what one can say is that whereas the spirit of tyranny was always more than willing, its operational, its organizational, and its technological flesh were fortunately weak. And I think one can say, without any kind of irony, that the greatest guarantee of liberty in the past was never laws or paper constitutions, it was the blessed inefficiency of governments. Liberty seems to become more and more difficult of achievement in an age where governments dispose of such extraordinarily powerful means as any government does today. Now, to illustrate the point which I was saying, that dictators, I mean, we have had the example of the Nazi dictators and, of course, of the communist dictators, the point that they disliked individuals having private life, and made a great effort to keep them continuously in touch with the history they were making. This fact is clearly illustrated if we compare the press in the totalitarian states with the press in democratic states, whereas with a few honorable exceptions, most of the press in democratic countries is devoted to the more sordid side of private life, such as murders, sex, sport, and so on. The press in totalitarian countries is consistently devoted to international news and to propaganda. The minimum of private life is admitted into the totalitarian press, and the reader is continuously having his nose rubbed into the public and historical life of the time. Now, let's pass on to another aspect of the relationship between individuals and history. The fact that most individuals spend a great deal of time outside of history does not mean that exceptional individuals do not exercise a considerable influence upon history. There has, of course, the notion of what the influence of individuals upon history has been has fluctuated from time to time. We have the sort of Carlylean conception of the hero determining history completely, and we have the conception which was stressed by Herbert Spencer and by some sociologists at the present time, that the individual plays no part at all, and that only great impersonal forces are somehow pushing people about. I would think that the fact of the matter is that historical changes are probably determined by the interaction of three main causes, determined by economic pressures of one kind or another, also by ideas, and also by exceptional individuals. The great impersonal movements are certainly at work, but I think it seems to me quite clear that there are many cases in which outstanding individuals direct so to say, the energies within these forces into certain channels. It seems to me fairly obvious that if, say, Bismarck and Hitler and Lenin had all died in infancy, it seems fairly obvious that the history of the later 19th century and of the middle years of the 20th century would have been different from what it is. It might have been similar, but I think without any doubt it would have been different, that these outstanding men did exercise a profound and a very important influence upon us. These speculations of what would have happened if what did happen hadn't happened seem rather vain, and yet they are rather interesting. The French philosopher Renouvier years ago wrote a book called Uchronia, which is the counterpart of Utopia. It's not about a place which doesn't exist, it's about a time which doesn't exist. It postulates that certain events did not occur and tries to deduce what the course of history would have been if those events had not taken place. Well, now I would like to illustrate finally the relationship between the individual and history by a brief consideration of progress. Now, progress is two things, I would say. Progress is partly a myth, and to some extent I think it's an observable fact. As a myth, of course, it's a new myth. It's a myth which arose more or less at the time of the Renaissance and reached a high pitch during the 18th and 19th centuries. And it took various forms. We had the sort of conditional progress of the 18th century, when it was believed that all you had to do was to get rid of kings and priests, and that everything therefore would go on getting better and better automatically if you did this. And in the 19th century there was this idea that if you gave people universal education and taught them how to use the new industrial devices, again the sort of utopian society would inevitably evolve and keep on getting better and better. And then there was a still more mystical idea that whatever you did, there would be an inevitability of progress, that man was in some way predestined to progress towards a perfect state. Well, I think the myths of progress have obviously been dispelled by the terrifying events of the 20th century. I don't think anybody believes as firmly, certainly, in the myths as they were believed in, say, 100 years ago or 200 years ago. But on the other hand, I think one can say that although the myths are not true, there is something in evolutionary and historical change which can be legitimately called progress. I mean, for example, in the evolutionary history of the world, it seems clear that one is justified in saying that the passage from ordinary molecules to giant molecules, which are the basis of life, was a progress, that the development of unicellular creatures, then of multicellular creatures, was a progression, and that the development of greater and greater complexities, which permitted greater and greater independence from the environment, was also a progress, and that the development of an elaborate nervous system again was a progress. The interesting point is, of course, that whereas the progress is visible at the leading edge, so to speak, of evolution, all the non-progressive forms are still there. I mean, we still have the giant molecules in the form of the viruses. We still have any number of unicellular creatures which can go on quite happily living their life. But at the leading edge, there is this something which does, I would say, which deserves the name of progress. And in history, too, in human history, where the evolution through natural selection has been, to a large extent, replaced by a kind of cultural evolution on the psychosocial level, again, I think we can legitimately speak of progress in certain fields. We can speak of a definite progress in the understanding of nature, in the control of nature, to some extent perhaps in the understanding of and self-control of human beings. So this is more dubious, I think. And here again we have the fact that there is a progress, so to say, at the leading edge, and that real people with genuinely Paleolithic mentalities can survive in a world directed by 20th century science. This is certainly a fact, but nevertheless I don't think it necessarily invalidates the idea of progress. Now, what we have to ask now is to what extent do we live with progress? Do we experience it? I think it's clear that it can be observed objectively, but can it be experienced subjectively? And this is, I think, a very interesting point. In regard to, of course, evolutionary progress, no, quite obviously it cannot be observed. To start with, there was, for the first 2 times 10 to the 9th years of evolution, there was no mind to observe the thing at all. And even when some kind of minds came into existence, the time span involved in any kind of progressive change was so enormous that no individual could experience it subjectively at all. In the lower Paleolithic, I imagine any kind of progressive change required at least 100,000 years. In the Upper Paleolithic required about 10,000 years. In the Neolithic times it required about 1,000 years, I think. And then we get into historical times where we get important progressive changes taking place in multiples of centuries until we finally get down to the present day where the changes take place in multiples or even fractions of decades. Now, when we have progress going at this rapid speed as we have now, it should be possible not merely to observe it objectively, but also to experience it subjectively. But now, again, is this a fact? Do we experience progress subjectively? I think we experience it much less than one would think that we do, Take, after all, an individual human life. This is not a progressive thing. This is not a curve which keeps on going up and up. It is a sort of cocked hat curve which rises to a certain point, remains more or less on the level, and then declines. And you cannot expect an old person sinking into decrepitude to be conscious of the world going up and up. I mean, all he is conscious of is himself going down and down. And this, I do think, is a profoundly important fact, that as individuals we are not progressive, whereas in a certain sense history may be regarded as progressive. We as individuals, being non-progressive, find it very difficult to have a direct experience of progression. But then there is the fact, of course, that the human beings have an almost infinite capacity for taking things for granted. We look up at a ceiling, a sort of luminous golden ceiling, and long to get there. But when we get there, we find ourselves walking on a piece of disregarded linoleum. I mean, this is just the floor that we're walking on, and we take it so completely for granted that we are not conscious of the fact that it is a progress from where we were down below. And of course, every individual is born into the world as it is on his birthday. I mean, the modern child regards TV and jet planes as part of the nature of things, and he has no basis by which to, nothing to compare them with. I mean, this is just, these things exist, and he is not conscious, therefore, that a great progress has been made in these fields. Then again, of course, private life remains to a very considerable extent unaffected by progress. It is, in certain aspects of it, of course, are affected, but a great many of the factors which make common life important, private life important to us, simply aren't affected by the general march of progress. That we remain in a curious way independent of this thing which objectively, when we look at it from the outside, is so obviously of immense importance. Dr. Johnson had a couple of lines which are relevant in this context. He says, "How small of all that human hearts endure, the parts which kings or laws can cause or cure." Well, to kings and laws we must add now advancing technology and scientific breakthroughs and so on. These still, although they are in some sense much more important than kings and laws, they still remain to a considerable extent outside our immediate experience. And Johnson had another very nice remarks. He said, public affairs vex no man, and the news of a lost battle never caused any man to eat his dinner the worse. And conversely, the news of a major scientific breakthrough or the news of a new cosmological theory never caused any man to eat his dinner the better, that do remain in a strange way very isolated from this immensely important factor in our public life. So that we see that here yet again I've used the phrase that man is a multiple amphibian. And here again we see our amphibious existence, this existence torn between the world of objective progress and the world of subjective, no particular progress, the world of private life and the world of history. We remain in this kind of uneasy balance between these two worlds. And I shall end with quoting this dark and memorable lines of Fulk Greville, where he says, "O wearisome condition of humanity, born under one law to another bound, vainly begot and yet forbidden vanity, created sick, commanded to be sound. What meaneth nature by these diverse laws?" And what indeed? And then let us end with the question, because we simply don't know the answer. Thank you.